Hey y'all, Mrs. Gaffney here, doing your evidence of evolution notes. So a couple things to keep in mind before we start. No one has witnessed the entire history of life on Earth, right? I mean, we live max 100 some years if we're lucky. And evolution, we're talking millions and billions of years. If you just did that Earth timeline, precisely 4.6 billion years, right? Nobody has been around that long. So a lot of this has been working backwards with pieces of evidence. And so it's more of a historical science. You can see on the bottom note there, we're looking at end products of events, in other words, fossils and current species, and then trying to piece things together and go back from there. So you'll find that this is a very different science than what we've done so far in biology. So some of you might connect a little more with this. Some of you might go, history, not interested. That's fine, whatever, but it is kind of interesting piecing these things and seeing what's related, so I hope you enjoyed a little bit. And the other thing is, nobody has observed the process of speciation from start to finish. So speciation, if you'll remember, you need to know that word, is the process of a common ancestor splitting off into new species. And it happens over thousands of years. We're not talking like a couple generations. We're talking about environments changing, mutations happening, and then the environment selecting for those mutations by who gets to have babies and who dies, right? So speciation is the process of things splitting off into species. And the defining thing there is that they're not able to mate with, if we had this original population and we split off into two, if you took individuals from these two new populations, they cannot mate and have a fertile offspring. Then they would be officially a new species. So cladogram and phylogenetic trees are how we keep these things organized and lay out our theories of who's connected where. The difference between the two, cladograms are just showing relationships, and typically they're organized by defining events that split those species off. For instance, if we look at this one up top here, you've got ray-finned fish and lungfish. And then we go to salamanders and frogs. So if we keep going up here, frogs and turtles have a common ancestor, but they've definitely gone some different directions. So if you think about defining features, well, frogs are amphibians and turtles are reptiles. So big differences there with amphibians breathing through their skin. They're bringing in moisture through their skin. I mean, obviously turtles have the shell and all. So things like that. Or if we were looking at a cladogram that had sharks and dolphins on it, for example, or even sharks and ray-finned fish. Sharks are all cartilage, and then eventually we get bone introduced, and invertebrates might come in there. So we're looking at these different defining features that these species have that are very different from the things that have branched off from their common ancestor. The phylogenetic trees are also going to show time, like how much time has passed since the speciation occurred. So you can see over here with our foxes and wolves and dogs, giant pandas at the bottom there. Sorry, my head's in the way. Let's do this. There we go. Yeah, so it's just interesting to see where they branched off, how closely they're related. And we're going to talk about different ways we can make those connections. It's not just theory at this point. Okay, so we have some evidence, of course, our notes, evidence for evolution, that helps us piece those things together. So this is all the stuff I just said, I guess. I just liked the picture up while I was talking. So if you want to pause this and write it down. The other cool thing about phylogenetic trees and cladograms, you can see where events happen sometimes in that cause the speciation. So geography very closely lines up with those, and it's kind of neat to piece those things together. So you can see down here it says both show relationships between different organisms, but phylogenetic trees show the time. Oops, why is that thing on the bottom? There we go. So phylogenetic trees have branches that show time and amount of change. So here we go. This is the one I'm used to talking about. I just hit it later. So sharks, all cartilage, and you can see here we're looking at each of these defining features that are splitting them, which is kind of neat. Same thing here, lungs. Everything up here has lungs from this common ancestor down on the bottom. But then we're going to move on to solid bones on this branch. Over here we have birds that have hollow bones. We move up, we have pointed ears. Humans even have a little point left. I mean, it's like this little bump. I don't know if I have it actually. Maybe a little bit right there. Or, you know, we had a common ancestor with pointed ears. So I can't remember what it's called. There's a name for it, but anyway. All right, pace of evolution. So this was mentioned in the last notes just a little bit. Gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. So this is where geology can tie in closely with this. Gradualism, we're just accumulating changes over time. Genetic drift goes with that. It's kind of random. Typically, the environment hasn't changed drastically in a short amount of time. It could be like if you think rainforest and all the bright colors and novel features that are there, those probably are more of a gradualism thing because there's plenty of mates, there's plenty of food, there's plenty of space. I mean, minus forest fragmentation, but you know, the resources are plentiful, so the mutations that happen are more random and gradual. Whereas punctuated equilibrium, we've got long periods of stable time, and then we have something rapid that happens. So maybe a very large asteroid hits the Earth and we don't have sun for a while, you know, because, oops, sorry, the cat's coming to say hello. Or a volcano, that's what I meant to say. It's like my brain wasn't making that connection. Volcano explodes, very big one, okay, and it blacks out the sun for a while, and things are going to die off that don't, like you think plants and things that eat those plants. Well, if they die off, you know, whatever's left over is what we have to move on forward with. So things that cause rapid change. So evolution can include both types of change. It all depends on the environment and what's available. Many groups show evidence of both. Speciation can also occur without much physical change on the outside. So that could be, you know, a population of coyotes gets split on a mountain range, you know, and eventually they breed so far apart, they still look similar, and maybe they can still have babies, but the babies aren't fertile because the differences are so much. So speciation can happen without physical change, or there could be a lot of change and they could still be able to mate. So I have a picture of warblers here over on the side. Again, I'm obsessed with birds, so warblers, here we are. We have all these different types of warblers that are able to fly together. They look a little different, but man, if you've ever gone bird watching and tried to tell the difference between warblers, I have a whole separate app with warblers because they're like these minute differences, but they know, you know what I mean? So they haven't had a lot of physical change, but they don't usually crossbreed. You know, a redstart stays with a redstart, and that's that. So if you have time and you're bored, go look up warblers and just take a peek. It's really interesting that they can stay sorted out with each other. Oops, go back here. So we have salamanders here. This is another activity that we can do sometimes in class. We won't be doing this one this time around, but just showing how some of these populations have shifted over California, and we have a mountain range in between them, and we have natural selection working on the populations independently, causing different traits to evolve. So you can see we have some color variations here, but they all look fairly similar otherwise, structure-wise, right? But they have become so different that they can't reproduce and have fertile offspring. So that's the big thing with speciation. Some of these slides that are in green, these are just examples. So you can go through these and look at them with the PowerPoint that's posted in Google Classroom. Just to keep these notes short, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. We're going to keep going forward, but there's just a lot of fun examples here. I find this stuff fascinating. Okay, a couple things that help us make phylogenetic trees and give us evidence. Fossils, that's kind of the no-brainer, right? We're trying to piece these fossils together. So we have something called transitional fossils, where we're seeing features that are in, the present day species, but they also existed in, the past species. So an example of that would be like there's an ear bone in whales that they've matched with something called Pakicetus, which was a wolf-like creature that was on land. So they think whales actually came from a land mammal that eventually adapted to being in the ocean, which is really crazy. But they also have femurs in snakes. That's another transitional fossil that maybe they had feet at one time and now they don't. So they have whole pelvis and femur. I can't remember if whales do too. They might. I'm almost positive they do. But they also have phalanges in their fins, meaning like the finger bones. There's no reason they need those with a fin, right? So those would be transitional things that we would find in fossils. Derived traits, so derived and ancestral traits are types of transitional fossils. Derived would be new traits that are not in the ancestral species. So again, if we're talking Pakicetus and a whale, I mean, Pakicetus had fur, it looked like in these pictures that they've recreated of it. Whales do not. So the smooth skin on the whale would be a derived trait because Pakicetus, wasn't made completely for the water. It was definitely a land and water mammal. Ancestral traits would be features that, the ancestor had that stuck around. So an example would be, and I always get yelled at for how I say this, but Archaeopteryx had these teeth. I don't know if you can see in this picture, but it has teeth here. So this is like the poster child for transitional fossils, this fossil. It's got a few different features, but no birds now have teeth except for geese. So that would be an ancestral trait that geese held onto that Archaeopteryx had. So ancestral traits also for birds might be feathers. There's a lot of evidence and more evidence that dinosaurs had feathers. So they would have hung on to that. They might have more than the dinosaurs did at one point, but it's still a trait, an ancestral trait that stuck. This is a vocab word, and so were those last three. Sorry. These three are vocab words. I tried to put the vocab words in pink and underline them to show you that they are important. So if you see pink and underlined, that's a good word to make a flashcard with, okay? Homologous structures. So these are things that are similar across species, but they have different functions, like they've evolved differently. So an example would be the human arm. So I always think homologous human arm, and I try to remember this picture. That sticks in my head for some reason. But you can see we've got metacarpal bones here, the wrist bones. I wish that bar would go away. Sorry, people. I'm new to Google Slides, like I said. So you can see the wrist bones. This is the cat leg, I guess you would call it, forearm. Similar bone structure here. So we've got the two bones, the phalanges, finger bones. And then same thing in the whale. We have wrist bones. We've got these two, they're shortened, but they're like the arm bones. So it very much mimics the structures of the human and the cat. And the bat has it as well. So again, those little carpal bones in there with the phalange bones and, the full getup. So we would call those homologous structures. They typically indicate a common ancestor at one point, and then of course speciation has pushed them farther and farther away. So we'll get into embryonic structures later, but they develop from the same embryonic structure, meaning they embryonic embryo, meaning, from the womb or the egg or wherever they were, they have these structures that started that way and then developed a little differently. As you can see, they have. So homologous structure means similar structure, different function. Analogous structure would be the pair word with that. So it's the opposite. They all have a similar function, but very different development. So a moth does not have any bones in its wing, but it's using it to fly, like a bat using it to fly. But again, different bone structure there. So they're not closely related. It's more that their environments had the same pressures that developed these same features. So opposite of homologous. Cat's coming to say hello again. She really likes evolution, apparently. Vestigial structures. So these are fun. They're features that no longer serve a function. So we can see here, oh yeah, there's our snake pelvis, ribs. You don't need a pelvis and femur unless you had feet or legs at one point. So it's something that didn't kill them to keep. So there it is, but it doesn't have a purpose anymore. They don't use it for walking. And the same thing with the whale. It's got a pelvis and a femur. So here's more examples. I didn't put the appendix on here. That always comes up in class because there actually is some new science on it that it helps with digestion. So I didn't put that one on there, but one that I usually bring up in class would be, like male nipples. They're not feeding children. They're just there, right? A couple other examples here in the green, you can see fingernails on the fins of manatees. That one creeped me out a little bit. I didn't realize that. So you can read through them. They're fun. And then we have the embryo similarities. This is cool stuff, you guys. So we'll come back to this slide, but I want to show you here. So if you weren't looking at the top, well, in class we have this all fancy where you can cover it up and you don't see the names in the top. Try to pick up the human. I mean, look at how similar all of those are. I just think that's crazy. It blows my mind. Fish, salamander, tortoise. I mean, very, very, very different animals, but look at how close those embryos are. So definitely, again, common ancestor. So something about this development really works well for embryos, right? And then we branch off from there. We've got all these differences and mutations that have accumulated to make us who we are and them who they are. So embryos of closely related species have very similar patterns of development. You can find some really cool experiments that they're doing with this right now, like with chickens and trying to bring back some dinosaur traits, like manipulating their genome to try and bring back some of those traits and what happens when they put in certain genes, how the chick turns out. I mean, it's crazy stuff, really cool. I mean, you could argue hopefully not cruel, I guess, but you should look into it a little bit if you have free time. It's pretty neat. And even this, all vertebrates have tails and gill slits as embryos, even humans. Pretty crazy stuff. The last piece that we're going to talk about is biochemistry comparisons. So what that means is amino acid sequences. Do you remember when we did that back in DNA, where we had all these amino acids lined up and we were comparing them and trying to find mutations? So we can use those to make more accurate phylogenetic trees and cladograms as well. So we're comparing the sequences, seeing how many similarities and differences there are, and then trying to make our tree based on those. So you'll have an assignment coming up that does that. And then here are some more examples of biochemistry comparisons. So you can look at those in your free time. And that's all I have for you today. Enjoy your day.